Hello! How are you all doing on this fine Thursday evening? I hope you're all enjoying life, that you've found ways you can actually say you're enjoying life, that you've had time for your spiritual disciplines of prayer, meditation, study, worship, fasting, that you spent time with God. Today, we'll continue our journey through the book of Genesis. We're in chapter 9, probably the final verse, the final chapter of the flood story. As in chapter 10, we're going to go on to a lot of the nations that have been created after the flood. My reading today will come from the English Standard Version, and I hope you join with whatever translation you most prefer. And again, if there are any topics you want me to cover besides Bible studies, please let me know. And I hope you have a chance or a desire to share this and our continuing journey through the Bible with others. But first, let us pray. O God, creator of all things, we ask that you continue to watch over us and guide us. Open our eyes to your word as we read. Open our minds to what it means and how it applies in our lives. Open our hearts to your grace and how it is we can take your word, your grace, your love, your gospel out into the world. In your name, in your Son's name, and in the presence of the Holy Spirit. Amen. As I said, today we are going to be in Genesis chapter 9. And God blessed Noah and said to his sons, and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I give you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning from every beast. I will require it from man, and require it and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. And you, be fruitful and multiply. Increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, Behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you, and every living creature that is with you. For all future generations, I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the people of the whole earth were dispersed. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backwards, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew that what his younger son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So that is chapter 9, the final chapter of the flood story. And as I said, there was a lot more going on in this chapter than there was in the previous one, wasn't there? And unfortunately, we're not going to have the time to really go into the nitty-gritty detail of everything. Because much like, say, Genesis chapter 1, this chapter, like every chapter in the Bible, there's so much there. And just I'm sure with me, and I'm sure many of the others out there, this chapter had a lot of things that had us questioning, didn't it? And we'll get to that. Just like I want you to remember the name. The name Canaan. It's going to be quite an important name, especially when we see who are descended from that one person. But first, let us look more closely at chapter 9. In this chapter, we pick up after everyone and all the living creatures had gotten out of the ark, after that sacrifice Noah had made. We pick up with speeches that God makes. And this first one I think is very important. Don't get me wrong, all of them are, but this one is definitely important because we're seeing a renewal of creation. When we look back and see what God is saying, go forth, be fruitful and multiply, that takes us back to the creation story in Genesis chapter 1, where humanity, made in the image of God, is told, be fruitful and multiply. God created order out of nothingness, created order out of chaos, and gave us this beautiful, wonderful creation. And that was in chapter 1. Here we are in chapter 9. After God used a chaotic and traumatic, apocalyptic event to purify the world of this sin of violence, this glorification of violence. We've seen that before, haven't we? But let's go on. Using a chaotic event like a flood. And remember, in the ancient times, especially among people that grew up or were in an area that was landlocked or had little access to water, they would see something like a flood as a true apocalyptic event, a true end times. water, oceans were seen as a source of chaos. And God used that. God used that to restore order. And after the waters receded at God's command, God is reestablishing and renewing that ordered creation, starting with the command to be fruitful and multiply. But it doesn't end there. Once again, we are given stewardship over the world. Once again, we're given dominion over the world. But there's a slight bit of change here. Yet, we are brought back to the creation story, where we are given dominion over the world. But here, something else is added. We're told fear of us will be part of the animal kingdom. And even more than that, we've been given permission to put meat on the menu. Every time I read that, I'm kind of flabbergasted. Meat wasn't on the menu before then? That's odd, isn't it? And yet, this is the first time we hear that. But let's go back first to that idea of the animal kingdom having the fear of us. This doesn't mean that they are absolutely terrified. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of animals, for very good reason, that are afraid of humanity. And at the same time, we don't want to dissuade them of some of that fear. It also means that we're supposed to be at the top. We're supposed to be the ones with dominion. This fear isn't just that fear of, oh no, it's a human, run away. It's, oh no, there's the ones on top. They are the predators on top of the food chain. That is supposed to be a part of the animal kingdom now. Just as we are now allowed to eat meat. So this kind of brings up the idea that apparently before the flood, humanity were vegans. At least that's what we can interpret by that. Whether or not it was true, I'm not sure. But that also begs the question, how do you interpret the first 11 chapters of the Bible? Are they absolute history, or, as they are probably more likely, are they tales of myths and legends that are meant to explain God in a way we can understand because of what that mystery really is? And yet, there are going to be people who will see this and decide for their own spiritual development and health that they're going to give up meat, that it's going to be a part of their spiritual journey. And one thing we need to recognize is it's all right if they do that. Just as it's all right if we decide to be omnivores. Oh, there's a big word, isn't it? Omnivore. Basically, it means that we can gain our sustenance off plant and animal. So it really doesn't matter which we choose or prefer, but all are now allowed. But notice the prohibition on what sorts of meats aren't allowed isn't there yet. That comes later. But going back to this idea that creation is once again being reestablished and renewed is important. Because we're being reminded that it is God who brought about this order. God who brought about this renewal. And it was always in God's plan to ensure humanity's survival. Not every one of the flood stories throughout history has that element. And we'll come back later to that as we get to the end of these speeches. From there, we are told not to eat what has its life in it or its blood. The reason for this, let me actually read the verse. Let's see, it is let's start at verse 3 and read through verse 4. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I give you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh, you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. What we're being reminded of here, is this idea that a creature's life essence is in its blood. And because all life is precious, we are not to consume that life essence. On the same token, we also know if you eat raw meats, you're probably gonna get sick. And they didn't have the medical advances or the gifts of healing that has come with our study and understanding of medicine, or the gifts of healing that God has given to many of our doctors and nurses and medical professionals today. So we're being told that if we do eat meat, we are to ensure that it is dead before we eat it and that it is fully cooked. That's important. And some of it is not just this idea of not consuming the life, but also keeping ourselves healthy. And we're being given a theological reason for that. Much later, as our development of science and medicine advance, we see why that is there. Which brings us to the next part. And I'm going to spend very little time on this. But as we move on to verse 6, whomever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. I want to spend very little time on this because there's so much more we have to go over. But this part, some commentaries and studies have referred to this as a crime and punishment section. And yet it only ever deals with man shedding the blood of man. And those who view this as a crime and punishment section, some of them, a lot of them, do tend to point it to a biblical approval of the death penalty. But I think that's the wrong way to really look at it. One of the first things we have to acknowledge is that when we start talking about justice within the Bible, we can't just point to this verse. We have to go on to many of the other areas of the Old Testament where it's there. And we find that justice in the Old Testament is not about retaliation. It's not about revenge. It's about ensuring that the punishment meets the crime. And yeah, that could mean in some cases where life is taken, life is going to be the exchange. But that doesn't necessarily have to mean they die. One of the other things we have to remember is God is the one who holds final judgment. But this is also reminding us why it is we shouldn't seek to bring harm to our fellow man or humanity. We are all made in the image of God. Each and every one of you is a precious, beautiful, wonderful creation of God. And the image of God is there within you. You are a brother or a sister, special and precious. We shouldn't be seeking to harm others. I think that is a better way of understanding that part of this passage. Especially when we remember one of the primary reasons for the flood in the first place was violence. Do not let violence beget violence. That's one of the things I believe God was trying to get at there. But as I said, we don't have a lot of time, and there's a lot more to cover in chapter 9. So let us continue on. And that's where we come to the covenant. I think at first I want to explain a little bit about covenants. So, a covenant is an ancient idea. There's almost a legal precedence for them. But usually in mythology and theology, especially with us and our understanding of God and how God relates to humanity, covenants are very important. These are an agreement or an obligation between God and humanity. Usually, the obligation is on humanity's side. What do we do so that the covenant, in acknowledgement of the covenant, and in acknowledgement of what God is doing for us? It's one of the reasons the law was created in the first place. It was how to acknowledge God's covenant with God's chosen people. How they were to live their lives in honor and worship of God. It wasn't about being legalistic. And a lot of Israelites and Hebrews and Jews today will tell you it's not about the legalism. It's about worshiping and honoring God. It always has been. But this covenant's interesting. Not only are we never given an end date, God is even telling us it's going to be an everlasting, an ever-enduring covenant. But there's no obligations on us. And it's not just limited to God's chosen people. God opens this covenant to Noah, Noah's sons, their descendants, and all living creatures. That never again will God use the chaos of a flood to destroy the world. And a sign of this covenant, a sign showing us that God is the covenant keeper, that this is God's obligation unto us, is that rainbow. This covenant becomes a message of hope. That after the destruction and chaos of the flood, renewal, rebirth, salvation will happen. And every time we see that rainbow, we know God is keeping God's covenant. It's a sign that God is a covenant keeper. It's important for us to remember that. That it is not us who have this obligation with this particular covenant. It is God who has chosen to do this. God has chosen that even though God could easily wipe out all life, that even though God could easily end it all, God chooses not to. God chooses mercy. God chooses grace. God chooses salvation and offers it to us. Remember that, brothers and sisters. Remember that it was grace, mercy, and salvation, love, that were chosen. Part of me wishes I could just end it right there, but we know that this chapter is not done. Wow. For just over 640 words, at least with this translation, there is a lot going on here, isn't there? And I'm almost out of coffee. But that brings us to what's going to be the closing segment of chapter 9. The family drama. That's the only way to put it. The only way to see it is that it is a family drama. Okay, so what's going on? Well, we come to this part where Noah takes up being a farmer. And I want to look at this a little more, a little closer. In the previous chapters, we saw that all the innovation, all the inventing came from the line of Cain. Metallurgy, arts, sciences, all came from Cain. Same with the glorification of violence. And here, we have this story of Noah taking up farming, planting a vineyard, and being the first wine maker. Whether or not you believe Noah was actually the first wine maker, it really isn't the important part here. What's important is this concept, this idea of reclaiming the creative process from that sinful line and bringing it into the righteous line. Showing that acts of invention and innovation and creation are part of our worship of God the Creator. That's what's important. That it is that being able to create is part of who we are as creations of God. And it's not sinful or denied us. In fact, it shouldn't be. Noah, one of the more righteous men in the Bible, is an inventor. That's part of why that's there. It's also to explain some of the family drama that comes just in a little bit. Because Noah, probably excited with this first creation, this first batch of wine, drinks too much and gets drunk. And this isn't just a normal drunk, although it's really no way to put it in saying it's normal. But this is Noah getting really, really drunk, to the point that he passes out in his tent completely naked. Doesn't even cover himself. And leaves the flaps of his tent open for the world to see. He was probably so drunk, he didn't even know that's what he did. And I'm sure none of us have ever been that drunk. Anyways, so, when that happens, we're not actually being told that Noah did anything wrong. Although anyone who's ever been in that state will tell you it's not a good state to be in. And we really shouldn't try to emulate that. But this is where we get, and I want you to remember the name Canaan. I'm going to be saying it a lot. This is where we get to the family drama. Noah, in that state, is unable to do anything about it. And his youngest son, Ham, sees him in that naked, vulnerable state, and does nothing. Well, no, that's not true, is it? He runs off and tells his two older brothers. And I'm sure many of us, when we're hearing this story, are hearing Ham talk about, hey guys, you really got to see what Dad did. Ham probably thought it was going to be a funny sight. That he and his brothers were going to get a good laugh out of it. But that's not what his brothers did. His brothers take an overcautious way of handling this. They put their garment between the two of them, walk backwards into the tent, making sure that they never see their father naked, and drop the garment over him to ensure that his nakedness is covered. And when Noah wakes up and is told what Ham did, he is so furious that Noah curses his grandson. Canaan, the son of Ham, is cursed, while the two other brothers and their descendants are blessed. Not by God. Noah is the one who does it. You know, every time I come to this part of the story of Noah, I struggle. Why would Noah be so angry that he doesn't take his anger out on his son, but on his grandson and all of the descendants that come after Canaan? It doesn't make sense to me. I'm not even sure what the great sin was. I mean, all Ham did was see his dad naked and try to make some jokes out of it. And that is where I think the issue is. Ham did not show respect to his father. And the reason we see the extreme caution of the other two brothers is they are showing respect to their father. That's the issue. There's no other issue other than, did Ham respect his father? And in this instance, you really do have to say no. Ham was looking to get a joke at his father's expense. And it was going to be a pretty hurtful joke, wasn't it? This wasn't the standard comedy that you can have between children and parents, where they kind of jab each other in that loving way where they know where the boundaries are and never cross them. Or when they do, they immediately stop and apologize. This was Ham, in a sense, being cruel. And his brothers, while they may have thought it was funny to see their father in that state, instead of relying on that moment, they tried to fix it. That is what we need to remember here. It was about respect. We should always seek to respect those around us, especially when we remember that, in a sense, we are all related to each other. And again, remember Canaan, that name, and who his descendants eventually be. And we might also see the other reasons why that story was placed here. But until then, until we start on to chapter 10, I hope you've all enjoyed this time of study, this time of being around a fire that was poorly made. I hope you all have a good evening. I hope you all have a wonderful time. I look forward to seeing you the next time we have a Fireside Bible study. And seriously, if there are any other topics of theology or what it means to be Christian you want me to go over, please let me know. If you think there are others who would enjoy these studies, share this with them. Show them that there are many ways that they can grow and learn more and might even find a love for studying the Bible. But until we see each other again, go with God and be blessed.